So, good morning, everybody. I've been asked to talk about strategizing for a post-COVID-19 reality. The problem with strategy is that this is a game plan, and usually with a game plan, at least you need to know some fixed points on the field. The problem is that the field is changing so quickly that the plan is usually outdated sooner rather than later. And Graham, I'm sure you'll agree that we're seeing that reality in China as well, where a lot of the issues that were assumed to be consistent going forward now are not. And I'm going to show you some images around that. I think the real issue here is that contingency and mitigation are key. So when we talk about risk treatment plans, we have to keep in mind the contingency, which is what you can't really control and how you manage that, and the mitigation around what you can control and how you're going to treat that. I'd like to just pose some questions about formulating strategy up front, because we're going to come back to that later if I'm going to do any justice to the topic that, Chris, you've given me. And that is, what is likely to remain known going forward? So, Graham, thank you so much for the segue. I think that you've posed some really interesting issues going forward. But I think what we also have to look at is what we know is certain to change. And then we have to also ask what we don't yet know. Because unless you can address those three questions, your strategies are not going to be sufficiently robust in meeting the contingency and mitigation requirements. One of the things that I'd like to pose is, what areas of your business do you absolutely have to protect? Because one of the key messages that's coming out of what we're finding right now is that there are a lot of areas of the business that we thought we absolutely have to protect, and we're finding that we don't necessarily have to do that. New ways of work being one of them, but I think perhaps some of our key products and services going forward are other areas that we're going to have to think about there as well. So I want to show you some of the key images for me that have really spoken to me about what are the results of COVID. We're seeing totally new consumption patterns in streets that ordinarily were jam-packed with traffic, with foot traffic, with people, today are bare. And I think this is something we're going to see going forward, because I fully agree with you, Graham. We're definitely going to have social distancing in the short to medium term. We're also seeing ports being clogged, and not just because some are behind the wave with regards to, and you'll excuse the pun because of the port, right? Andrew, that's for you. So it's not just about the clogging of ports. It's about the reassignment of now what has to be delivered. That's the key message that comes out of this image. And also the suspension of rent, of the ways in which businesses thought they had to operate. This image was very powerful for me as well. So given those results, I want to ask and rather share a number of findings that are coming out of the COVID-19 reality, and then ask a number of key questions that perhaps and hopefully will contribute to some strategic thinking going forward. So what we do know, so just going back to those questions that I asked initially, what we do know is that economies have been fundamentally disrupted. And in South Africa, the relevance of what we thought was a key structure, like ratings agencies, and what we thought to be absolutely valuable as far as our own consumption, as far as the way in which government thought certain industries were absolutely valuable, now are being challenged. What we're also seeing is the potency of very decisive leadership. Now, America is an interesting case as far as one side of the foil is concerned, but South Africa is another. And for me, what's really interesting is the extent to which President Ramaphosa is being seen as a very potent and successful leader because of the decisive leadership going forward. What we're also seeing with regards to economic disruption is the rise of cash versus cashless economies. And this is something that I'll be speaking about later on, but certainly something that we really need to start looking at going forward as a new normal. The second finding is that we're starting to see that global supply chains are fragile. The reliance on any kind of Sinocentric factory, sorry, that should be has, not guess. Well, that's an interesting Freudian slip, which I'll come back to in a minute. It wasn't on purpose, but I'm just seeing it now. The reliance on any kind of Sinocentric factory, I think, is now starting to be challenged. And what we have to see is that the just-in-time production processes are now going to start being replaced. What we've done in the past is we've traded off cost against security of supply. And that has really interesting implications with regards to a number of key services and critical services, like, for example, electricity. The third finding that we're seeing is about this issue about being anti-fragile. And the question that I really want to ask is big really that beautiful? We're starting to see that big government has been deeply challenged, particularly with the rise of a number of mayoral or provincial leaders coming up and, in fact, directly opposing central leadership, whether that's in a factory or organizational type of setting, which we've seen with Amazon, dare we say. We've certainly seen that in America. We've seen that in Europe as well, where governors have directly opposed central leadership. So from a governmental perspective, I think big being beautiful is being deeply challenged. And that's going to have some very interesting implications for South Africa going forward. We're also starting to see anti-fragile coming out with regards to the extent to which technology is really adaptive. And what we thought was going to be a sufficiently agile, fast-moving and sexy type of technology actually isn't. We always thought that the alcohol and liquor industry was sufficiently adaptive and resilient, dare I say. Baijiu, which is the second largest beer manufacturing plant in China, is not going back to manufacturing beer. They are remaining as a detergent manufacturer going forward. How adaptive is that? Car manufacturers are now starting to manufacture ventilators. And interestingly, some of them are starting to see better returns. We still wait to see how long that's going to last, but certainly better returns than with the other types of components that they were producing previously. So what really remains anti-fragile? We need to keep that in mind when we start looking at how we're going to be strategizing going forward. So what are the response moves that now come out of that particular finding, that economies have been disrupted, global supply chains are fragile, and we have to now start asking about who or what is actually anti-fragile? So when we talk about the economic disruptions, there are two very plausible types of strategic responses that now start coming out. The first is that there's a return to normal, but with increased efficiencies and an increased reliance on the state. Because now small businesses, going to have to be drawing on the protective fund that now has been put in place to support them. The problem with that is that most certainly is going to drive a further economic crash, which then would give rise to the further cashless type of economies that I was alluding to earlier. The work from home, the education from home, that's going to be a new normal, without a doubt. The extent to which many families have been paying exorbitant school fees for services that are deemed far less valuable than what parents can actually give with the new type of anti-fragile education that's now being made available for free, dare I say, that's going to create a very new kind of efficiency as we return to normal, which will be new. The picture on the right-hand side is a set of, I think it's 36 eggs in a pack. This was a picture that I took yesterday when I went shopping for basic essentials, and a man was buying several of these 36 packs of eggs. And I asked him if he was very religious and getting excited for Easter. And he said, no, he was actually buying these for all the people in his community because he was the only one who was going out. And I think that's also part of the new normal. You're going to start having a lot of microeconomies and shared economies starting to come out as part of the new normal. Now, we'll talk about what is a shared economy in a moment, but without a doubt, communities and smaller types of economic supply chains that most certainly are going to be deregulated are starting to pop up already and support one another in new ways. I think that part of this new normal, because of the economic disruption, is going to be a new approach to what is valuable. And communities are going to define that rather than big businesses and, heavens forbid, big government. In terms of the responses to the global supply chains being fragile, I think there's one of three or a combination of two of some of these three issues that are starting to come up as options to respond to the fragility of global supply chains. We're going to start seeing a lot more regional supply chains happening. And with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement being driven by players no less than our president, certainly we're going to start seeing some new government, and we're going to start seeing a new approach about customer adaptiveness. And I think this is something that I want to start putting forward as something for us to think about strategically as South Africa. So the questions here really are, how do you empower the customer as a partner and not just a payer? We're starting to see very successful businesses like Seesaw, which I understand has got a lot of South African IP as part of that, as part of the new schooling situation. Customer familiarity cannot be traded off for a footprint, a larger footprint any longer. The role of a niche business is starting to become part of this anti-fragile, and I think that's something we really have to look at in a major way. Given that I only have 2 minutes, I'm not going to dwell too much of that on that. I want to just say that given those findings, what's likely to remain known, what is known to change, and what we don't know yet, I think some industries certainly are not going to survive in their current form. Adaptation and diversification is now fundamental. And without a doubt, what we certainly know is that the form of opportunism is going to be unknown. But most certainly, we're going to see some very interesting opportunistic moves coming forward in the next few months. I can't wait to see it. In response to the question at hand, I think that you have to really ask yourself very deeply what parts of your business, in light of these realities, you have to protect. Are they part of who you are? Do they make a difference in terms of your competitive advantage? And in light of that, how risk competitive are you actually?